What's up YouTube? Capital G here, doing a boomer bust on one of the game's best kept secrets, and that is Gem Knights. I should have made this video probably over a year ago after Clash of Rebellion, but with so many powerful archetypes being released in that set like Cosmo and Performages, I think Gem Knights just got swept under the rug, and that's definitely my fault. Had I been watching the anime at the time, I probably would have honed in on Gem Knights and done a boomer bust back then. But full disclosure, I am going to try and be as blatantly honest and as impartial and unbiased as I possibly can, because everybody knows that Gem Knights is like my favorite deck in the game, and it's one of my favorite archetypes, right up there with Sotelo Knights and Boojins. So let's just go ahead and begin. Gem Knights were released in Hidden Arsenal 4. They ran through Hidden Arsenal 7, and then they got more support in Clash of Rebellion. They are fusion based, and I guess the best way to kind of describe the deck is a hyper aggressive fusion based deck. The deck wants to play extremely similar to like Mermail, where you don't really care about anything after the second turn. You're trying to get the game over as quickly as possible because Gem Knights don't have a very good grind game. In fact, they don't really have a grind game at all, and that's because the deck to this day really doesn't offer much of a stun factor, and the deck does struggle against, floating monsters, but the deck can definitely put a lot of big monsters on board. The deck has a trio of some extremely good fusion cards, and I would honestly say, if you just wanted to stack it up against any deck in the game at putting fusion monsters on the board, I'd honestly say that it's probably the best. And that's because even to this day, a lot of these cards were released in 2013. Cards like Gem Knight Fusion have not actually been power creeped. Now, there was a reason why Gem Knights were never really popular. Well, actually a few reasons. A lot of it had to do with just kind of the structure of the archetype. Gem Knights is an archetype that has about half a dozen just straight up vanilla monsters, which in 2013 didn't really make a lot of sense. Some of the DT archetypes such as Evil Swarm and X-Sabers, they've got your one vanilla monster here and there, but to give Gem Knights almost 6 normals didn't make a lot of sense, especially considering that a lot of the extra deck monsters require you to run these normals, such as Lapis Lazuli. You can only summon her by using a Lapis, so you're pretty much forced to run the normals. In addition, if that wasn't bad enough, you actually have some Gemini monsters in addition to the normals, and we all know Gemini monsters, when they're normal summoned, they initially count as normal monsters as well. So that was another reason, and I actually think that Geminis are largely worse than normals because you have to summon them twice. Like, you have to normal summon a monster that you already normal summoned just to get an effect that a lot of times is actually pretty underwhelming. There were also a couple of things about Gem Knights that really never made sense. You look at a card like Seraphonite, which is really good, lets you normal summon twice, but it requires a light monster. Now, if you know anything about Gem Knights, you know that the entire archetype is Earth attribute. So why they would make a fusion that requires a light when Gem Knights have no light monsters is pretty strange. You look at Gem Armadillo, which is the Stratos of the archetype, but it's not actually a Gem Knight card. It's actually just a gem, so you can't use it with a lot of the other big fusion monsters like Master Diamond or Lady Brilliant Diamond. Now let's go over some of the positives. Gem Knights can spam the board really, really easy, and this is one of the decks where if you're dumb enough to leave your field open, a lot of times you will get OTK'd. This is done largely by the fact that Gem Knights have some really good fusion spells. I would say collectively Gem Knights have the best fusion spells in the game, better than Shadows, better than Fluffles, better than any deck ever. And these are your power 3 cards. If you look at Gem Knight Fusion, it largely is very similar to something like Polymerization, almost identical. But what separates this card from a lot of the other fusion cards is this card can be used over and over and over and over again. And sometimes you will see players, when they're really going off with Gem Knights, they'll use this card 5-6 times in a turn, and it'll hit the graveyard maybe even 8 times in a turn. That's not hyperbole, it's actually happened. That means that not only can you use this to fusion summon multiple times, but you can also use it as a discard cost and just, like discard fodder for things like Prism's Effect or other cards like DDR, Twin Twisters, just other good cards. You have Absorb Fusion, which is another fantastic card. It's basically what happens when Polymerization and Rhoda meet. It's a card that basically tutors for any Gem Knight card that you want, and it gives you the option of also fusion summoning at the same time. That's pretty much never happened in a card. And then you have the granddaddy of them all, Brilliant Fusion, which lets you fusion straight from the deck, which isn't too unique anymore. Shadow, Red Eyes, they have cards like this. But what's cool about Gem Knight or Brilliant Fusion is it lets you fusion summon for anything. While it does come out at 0 attack and defense, there is a way of getting around that. And best of all, it summons Lady Brilliant Diamond, which is the boss monster of boss monsters in this deck, and she can tribute herself or any Gem Knight monster to get any Gem Knight monster from the extra deck, ignoring the summoning conditions. So that is absolutely fabulous. Gem Knights also have other ways of making their mass fusion summonings pretty cost efficient, not just being able to use Gem Knight Fusion multiple times, but when you look up Obsidian, and Lazuli, these are cards that make running normal monsters, I would say, at least tolerable, maybe even efficient, like cost efficient, because they can both be activated infinitely in a turn. They are not once per turn effects. You can use them 5-6 times in a turn if you find a way to do that, and they both make your cards float essentially. So when you actually look at some of the high-end monsters that require 3 monsters like Master Diamond and Brilliant Diamond, you think, wow, that's a 4-card investment. But if you actually do it right, it can actually be just a 1-card investment. Gem Knights is one of the only decks in the game that can consistently do a lot of burn damage without actually having to run burn cards specifically that go out of the way from what the deck actually wants to do. Running and summoning Lapis Lazuli is pretty common in this deck, especially when you don't actually have to, technically you don't even have to run Lapis to summon it. I know that Lapis is a requirement, but you can summon her from Brilliant Diamond, so you technically don't even have to run Lapis to summon her. And even though she can only be summoned once per turn, you can actually copy her effect with Master Diamond. Now, some of the problems that Gem Knights have are, man, the fact that the deck just can't grind. There is no grind game in this deck. The deck doesn't have much floating except for Lapis, except for Lazuli and Obsidian, and those largely only float when you're making offensive plays. So there's not going to be much of a grind game here if you're playing against a deck like Burning Abyss or Yang Zings, where all of their monsters float when they hit the graveyard. You're really just gonna struggle. The deck doesn't pretty much have any type of stun element to it. In fact, the only stun that you're really gonna get out of Gem Knights is by either adding some type of floodgates to the deck, like Goes in Match, or the little bit of stun that you might get out of the extra deck. But it's not going to come from your Gem Knight monsters. It's going to have to come from Xyz, things like Abyss Dweller or something of that sort. And those monsters can actually, like, their effectiveness can be limited by the fact that if you use Absorb Fusion, you can't actually summon monsters except Gem Knights that turn. And Gem Knights don't really have that much removal. Prism is really good. I mean, it can pop floodgates, it can get rid of problem monsters, it can stop stalling from your opponent, it can get rid of just any spell and trap that's face up on the field, but it can't take out face down spell or traps, which means that this deck definitely loses hard to battle traps. And especially when you know that your opponent has them, there just isn't really a great way of answering them. And then the last thing is Gem Knights, if your monsters can't beat over problems and you don't have a really strong power card like Regeki, you're going to really struggle against cards that cannot be targeted, because Prism is basically your most powerful and most consistent way of just being able to out any monster on the board. If you happen to run into something like a Dart Destroyer, it's gonna be a problem, because there just isn't an effective way of getting it off the board except by ramming your monsters into it. Gem Knights came out in a time where there wasn't too much floating in Yu-Gi-Oh, so being able to summon a whole bunch of big monsters was still kind of impressive. But Gem Knights does feel kind of like an old school caveman beatdown, where you're just summoning a bunch of monsters, ramming them into your opponent, and just crossing your fingers and hoping that it all goes well. I think that their competitive ceiling is probably about a regional top 8. I don't think that Gem Knights can compete on the YCS level at all. I think that they're a complete bust at that level or anything higher, because if you look at this format and you look at what they have to deal with, there are too many monsters in the format and just too many decks that can put monsters on board that can't be targeted. Things like Corinne, things like Dart Destroyer. In fact, Corinne could beat this entire deck by itself. Also, there are ways that Gem Knights can get locked out of the game completely without having any consistent spell and trap removal outside of Prism. Something like Domain could just completely shut you out of the door. What I think Gym Knights really honestly need is they need a card like Tiramisu. They need a card that is non-targeting removal that could maybe bounce a couple or spin a couple of cards off the field, because that would answer pretty much all the problems that the deck has. It would get rid of back row, it would solve the non-targeting problem, and it would also stop the endless kind of floating problem that Gym Knights have too, because when you have to attack into a Yang Zing and you don't have access to like a Bistwell that turn, you're probably just gonna get wrecked. That would answer all three of those problems. So let me know what you guys think. Gym Knights are one of my favorite decks in the entire game, but regional top 8 is probably about the height of this deck's power. You're not going to go much further than that unless you play absolutely perfectly and draw perfectly, and even then, I think that a regional top 8 would be extremely hard to pull off with Gym Knights, just because the games 2 and 3 are going to be difficult, because people are going to play more conservatively when they know that for the most part your only win condition is being able to OTK. But it's still extremely fun deck. It's got great artwork, and it's still a deck that I really like. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you for watching as always.